The drawer stuck as it always did, a quirk of the old mahogany dresser she and Mark had bought as a frivolous investment when they first considered themselves financially secure. A huff of irritation escaped her. This room was supposed to be her sanctuary, but lately it felt like a cluttered minefield. She pried at the heavy wood, then gave up and tugged the whole thing bodily towards her. It scraped against the polished floor with a shriek more suited to a horror movie than her tastefully decorated guest room. Inside, the usual mess. A tangle of guest towels, Mark's forgotten workout gear, the extra quilt they'd only ever used twice. Her hand brushed against something smooth beneath a pile of socks. She blinked, not registering it at first. A flash drive here? Annoyance flared anew. Mark's habit of casually leaving tech scattered had been growing worse lately. Then a cold rippled down her spine. It wasn't a flash drive. This was narrower, with what appeared to be a microphone input. A recorder. Why would he? She whispered, her own voice barely recognizable. Anger flared hot, quickly replaced by icy dread. Mark had no reason to secretly record things around the house, unless that sick hollow feeling in her stomach wasn't unfamiliar. Had she become that predictable? She didn't want to know. Curiosity gnawed, a hungry beast clawing at her composure. With shaking fingers, she plugged the recorder into her laptop. The files unfolded, a horrifying timeline that started innocently enough, then the sickening truth. Her voice laughing with his. They weren't just meetings or lunches anymore. Days, weeks of flirtation, of promises she'd broken. Her composure shattered. For a timeless moment, she simply sat there, the world reduced to the tinny echo of her own betrayal. Then the survival instinct kicked in. Breathe, act normal. Every smile, every touch with Mark from now on was a searing brand against her skin. It was worse when she confronted her lover. He didn't play dumb at first. His eyes flicked calculatingly, mirroring the frantic beat of her own pulse. Are you sure? Could be anything, he said. But it had been his name on that recording, his pet names for her, the things they'd shared. A wave of nausea forced her to look away. She should hate him. Her lies to him twisted in her gut now, every desperate plea for him to be patient and trust her now poison. But she couldn't afford disgust just yet. If Mark was onto them, this man was her only ally, however flimsy. Survival demanded she hunt for clues. Every room suddenly felt menacing. Shadows hiding, whispered evidence, unseen eyes. Mark had always been private. But this, the more she found, strange receipts, an unfamiliar bookmark in a book, the more real it all became. Questions hammered at her. How long has he known? Why play this cat and mouse game? What does he want from me? Guilt warred with a defiant snarl inside her. It wasn't fair. Yes, she'd betrayed him, but she wasn't the only one with secrets. Was she worth this elaborate torture? Or was her affair simply the excuse Mark needed for something else, something worse? Sleep evaded her, replaced only by a frantic internal monologue. Just leave. Cut your losses. You're smarter than him. But as her lies became more elaborate, so did the prison she'd built. Her smiles to Mark were a mask ready to crack. Her passion for her lover curdled into something cold and strategic. The facade was her lifeline, and with each passing day it grew heavier. The photo was wedged between the pages of a travel magazine in the bathroom. Their wedding photo. At first glance, innocuous. Then she noticed the crease, a single jagged line marring the glossy surface right across her throat. A coincidence? Maybe. Then again, maybe another of Mark's silent accusations. Her pulse spiked. A hummingbird trapped in her ribcage. She scanned the room, eyes darting, searching for something. But the bathroom was pristine as ever, all cool marble and blinding chrome fixtures. It mocked her. Mark. Her voice, thin and strained, bounced off the walls. The house was silent. Always silent these days when she was expecting him back. If he was even coming back. The possibility had been an occasional flicker of hope, but now it was edged with terror. A confrontation. If she still had the courage would be, what? An admission of guilt, a plea for mercy she didn't deserve. She sank down on the cool tiles. Was that even what Mark wanted anymore? The more she tried to decipher his cryptic clues, the more lost she felt. Her lover was no help. He was growing erratic, his desperation mirroring her own. Once a source of thrilling danger, he now represented only another complication. "He's playing with us," he'd hissed over the phone the night before. His voice pitched low. "We need to do something." Something. The word echoed in her head. Something could mean escape, a messy confrontation, or a darker thought coiled in her gut. Something desperate. Her hand still shook from where she'd gripped the phone until her knuckles went white, her lover's paranoia feeding her own. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Each creak of the house was a footstep. Every flicker of headlights meant discovery. Eyes were on her, she was certain. Mark's doing. Or maybe the lover was right, and someone else was watching, waiting. The mistake was so stupid it was laughable. If she could still find the humor in anything. One text, one wrong name, and her world had tilted further off its axis. Mark hadn't reacted yet, but it was only a matter of time. Had it been a deliberate test or simple fatigue muddling her fingers? The not knowing was the worst. The unfamiliar phone charger was the final straw, perched on the kitchen counter as if daring her to notice. She'd gone methodically down a mental checklist. Didn't belong to Mark, wasn't hers, no recent guests. A burner phone. Dread made her movements jerky as she scoured the device. Nothing useful, yet its very existence was an accusation. Sarah. The name drifted through her muddled thoughts. Smart, sensible Sarah, her oldest friend. They hadn't spoken intimately in months, not since the affair had begun in earnest. Was it a lifeline or a trap? Just coffee, she had texted, the words feeling foreign coming from her once chatty fingers. It was a desperate gamble. Sarah never minced words, and a true friend might offer the slap across the face she desperately needed. Or if her luck had truly deserted her, Sarah might play messenger for Mark's final devastating move. The shift started subtly. A lingering glance from Lisa at book club. The space around her in the grocery checkout line wider than usual. At first she clung to excuses. People were busy, distracted, imagining things born from her own guilt. But gossip had a way of seeping into the tiniest cracks, turning everyday interactions into loaded minefields. It was in the silences that the true change became undeniable. Whispers died the way as she approached. Laughter faltered. Once frequent invites for dinners or casual outings dried up. Was it the text? Had someone else seen it, piecing together the clues she desperately tried to hide? Or was this orchestrated by Mark, the humiliation spreading like a carefully cultivated virus? Mark himself was as maddeningly opaque as ever. If he knew, he gave no overt sign. Yet the careful neutrality of his every word, his polite but distant offers of tea or assistance with chores, felt more oppressive than an outright explosion. The waiting was agony. Each day bled into the next, a monotonous routine orchestrated around keeping up the ever more fragile charade. The lover was predictably spiraling. His calls were more frequent, his accusations thinly veiled. "You know he's onto us. When are you leaving that bastard?" The desperation she once found thrilling now made her stomach churn. She'd painted herself into a terrifying corner. A manipulative, increasingly unhinged lover. And a husband whose actions she couldn't decipher. Control. It was all about control, and she had none. The cracks in her facade were spreading. A forgotten lunch date with Sarah, or perhaps an intentional no-show. A scathing remark about absent-minded wives to the cashier. Were these noticed? Scrutinized, the world felt smaller, claustrophobic. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. His instability was terrifying. Once his possessiveness had been a heady mix of passion and danger. Now she picked her words with surgical precision. The wrong phrase could set him off. And while fear of Mark was always present, the lover's volatility felt more immediate, more unpredictable. Then, almost salvation, a text from her mother about an extended visit. Her finger hovered over the delete button. To flee now would mean admitting her crimes, but was that worse than whatever trap Mark had likely set for her? The near miss with her son was gut-wrenching. He stood in the doorway, eyes bright as she whispered feverishly into the phone, pleading with her lover for a plan for something. He hadn't asked, that trusting look still in his face. But she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that another moment and her lies would have poured out like poison. It was then, staring at the innocence reflected in his eyes, that she saw the true horror of her situation. He, everyone she had once cherished, was now just collateral damage. The careful compartmentalization she'd perfected was useless. If she didn't find an escape route, and soon, her downfall would take them all with her. Confrontation. The word echoed in her head as a promise and a threat. It had been weeks since that shattering moment with her son. The chasm between the mother he trusted and the monster she'd become yawning wider with each passing lie. Mark's subtle torture had lessened, replaced by an odd sort of space. She could almost respect him for it, giving her the rope with which to hang herself. But what leverage did she even have? The idea was laughable at first, yet it clung to her thoughts with the tenacity of a desperate animal. Gather evidence. Turn the tables. Not the kind that would save her marriage. That ship had not only sailed, but sunk in spectacular fashion. No, she needed proof of Mark's game. Something solid enough to give her the upper hand if it all came crashing down. Mark's office became her battleground. It was his sanctuary, always off limits, and invading it felt like a perverse act of defiance. Yet each late-night foray, sifting through files that made little sense to her, yielded small victories. An unsent email draft filled with cryptic accusations. A receipt for a storage unit she didn't recognize. He was gathering, waiting, but for what? The lover was no longer a source of strength. Each call was a new crisis. Do you have it yet? The money? We have to leave now. He hadn't even tried to veil his own self-interest lately. This was no longer about love, but his own escape. It sickened her, the realization that he might be her greatest danger right now. A cornered animal desperate enough to lash out, exposing them both. The message came tucked inside a birthday card from her mother. A cheerful bouquet, hiding the scrawled words. Tick-tock, time's running out. Her blood ran cold. Not directly accusatory, but who else would know? Blackmail felt too clumsy for Mark, but if not him, then who? The fear was familiar, but now it was edged with white-hot anger. Then, just as everything seemed to spin out of control, a distraction. Her father had a health scare, a hospitalization. Mark surprisingly solicitous. The picture of the concerned husband as they drove hours away to her childhood home. She played the part gratefully, her genuine terror over her father a much-needed respite from the constant role-playing. But the world she'd built was crumbling under the strain. She was fraying at the edges, forgetting appointments, snapping at a well-meaning friend who asked an innocent question. Everything felt like a threat, a test. The walls closing in, even as she was surrounded by concerned family. The night before they were set to return, she stood at the window, watching rain streak down the glass. Her father was improving, but the weight of her lies felt suffocating. She pictured them, her son trusting, her mother unknowingly offering support, her father clinging to life, while his daughter orchestrated this monstrous deceit. Was there still a sliver of good in her, something salvageable from the wreckage? The plea was wrenched from her lips, tears falling as she stared into the darkness. To Sarah, Sarah who would tell her, likely brutally, the truth she needed to hear. Or was it something else, a desperate prayer for absolution from a higher power? She wasn't even sure she believed in anymore. In the end, it didn't matter. The words choked in her throat, shame and fear warring with a sliver of defiance. The battle for whatever remained of her soul had begun, but even she didn't know who she wanted to win. Each message arrived a tiny blow chipping away at her sanity. At first, generic taunts easily brushed off as a random prankster. But as the weeks bled together, they grew disturbingly personal. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, a reference to a half-forgotten conversation with Sarah, even her grocery list for that week. She was being watched. Mark was the obvious suspect, but there was a wrongness to the tone. His anger had always been cold precision, a surgeon's scalpel wielded by an expert. This was different, messy, almost gleeful in its sadism. If this wasn't Mark, and now the lover was a liability, then who? The explosion with her lover felt inevitable, yet shocking in its intensity. His mask of charm finally slipped completely, revealing the ugliness beneath. "You think I won't expose you? Destroy everything you have," he'd spat, his face puce with rage. She'd frozen, the realization a bucket of icy water. Of course he would. He was as trapped as she was and far more desperate. Her attempts at counterattack were clumsy, born out of blind panic rather than strategy. A call to Mark's boss insinuating erratic behavior, laughable and probably just confirmed his suspicions of their affair anyway. A whispered rumor about the lover, a history of aggression to a mutual acquaintance she barely knew. It was all so petty, so futile. She'd become the caricature of a scorned woman, and it deepened her self-loathing. Then came the meeting, her sister-in-law. In the sterile brightness of a coffee shop, she saw not familial concern, but flint-eyed calculation. "I know," was all Helen had hissed, pushing a photo across the table. Her and the lover, a blurry shot, but undeniably them. Helen's motives were murky, revenge for some perceived slight, or perhaps her own twisted forms of leverage. Yet it was a lifeline of sorts. Helen had been scorned by the lover, a story of cruel manipulation she poured out with grim satisfaction. There at the table, surrounded by oblivious shoppers and tinkling barista trays, the beginnings of an alliance were forged. Gossip, always a constant hum, erupted into a full-blown symphony. Snippets of conversations filtered back to her. She was at once an object of pity and monstrous fascination. Her meticulously crafted world was now dinner theater for suburban voyeurs. The shame was scorching, but even worse was the isolation. Even those who'd once been kind offered only tense platitudes before slipping away. The act happened in a haze of sleeplessness and half-formed desperation. It was so far beyond anything she'd ever contemplated that it felt like watching herself from outside her own body. Only the aftermath was clear, staring at her hands still damp with disinfectant, the air thick with the chemical smell. There was no going back. Guilt gnawed at her, yet beneath it thrummed an unexpected flicker of power. She'd gotten away with it, this terrible thing. An intoxicating mix of terror and exhilaration left her shaking. Sleep was an impossibility, replaced by vivid nightmares that felt like warnings, and waking moments where she no longer recognized the desperate stranger in the mirror. The line between what was real and what her tormented mind conjured was blurring. A footstep she swore she heard in the empty house, a flicker at the corner of her vision, even a note left on her pillow she couldn't recall writing. Was she unraveling, or were these more machinations by her unseen tormentor? Perhaps both were equally likely now. A plan began to take shape in her fevered mind, a desperate gamble, likely doomed to fail, yet strangely exhilarating. There was freedom in knowing she likely had nothing left to lose. She'd play along, become a willing participant in their cruel game. It had all the makings of a disastrous thriller plot, the kind she used to mock during lazy Sunday afternoons with Mark. Now she was the cliché. The note was her first lure, short mimicking her stalker's usual cryptic style, demanding a meeting in a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. It was a risk, the kind her old self wouldn't have dreamed of, but desperation fueled a strange sort of bravado. She'd be prepared, not with a weapon, too unpredictable, but documentation. Every message, every odd occurrence was meticulously gathered. The fallout was immediate, an anonymous tip to the police insinuating drug use by her lover and leaked to a sleazy tabloid. A carefully manufactured scene of financial irregularities at work, the trail of manufactured evidence pointing directly back to Mark. It was vindictive, scorched earth warfare on all fronts, and innocents were bound to be hurt. The sting of guilt was sharp, but blunted by a cold numbness. She mourned those she was dragging down with her. The friendship sacrificed and the reputation sullied, yet there was a grim satisfaction in taking some control of her own narrative, even if that control was ultimately an illusion. Sarah's name on her phone screen was a seismic shift. They hadn't spoken since she'd bolted from that aborted coffee meeting. The words stuck in her throat. An apology, a plea for help. Nothing felt adequate. Sarah spoke first, voice tight. "I'm coming over." It was less a question, more a statement. The betrayal, when it came, was a physical blow. Sarah's involvement was far deeper than she'd let on. Tears streamed down her face as she outlined her own scheme, a twisted desire for revenge fueled by years of festering resentment over some long-forgotten slight. Sarah, the unassuming one, had played the role to perfection, orchestrating events from afar while feigning innocent concern. The motel room was just as she'd imagined, dingy, smelling vaguely of stale cigarettes and despair. The figure in the shadows was frustratingly unidentifiable. The voice, electronically disguised, dripped with sadistic glee. It wasn't Mark, not her lover, not Sarah, but someone familiar enough with them all to craft this elaborate punishment. The motive was simple, the joy of destruction. They reveled in her desperation, painting a vivid picture of the absolute ruin she faced. Mark presented with falsified documents, his career imploding before his eyes. The lover, cornered by police, his own instability making him a maddeningly unreliable narrator to his fabricated tales. Public meltdowns seemed inevitable. It happened at the supermarket of all places. The fluorescent lights were blinding, faces around her a grotesque blur. Then the article, the one about the lover, splashed across the tabloid stand. Laughter bubbled in her chest, hysterical and raw, drawing worried stares from shoppers who edged past, their expressions a mix of pity and lurid curiosity, fleeing. The thought was always there, a desperate whisper in the back of her mind. But where? Who would harbor a fugitive, especially one as headline-worthy as she was bound to become? Maybe she could disappear, become a ghost? The image, a ragged figure on a lonely highway, was bleakly fitting, yet even in the depths of her despair, a flicker of defiance remained. If she was going down, she would at least steer the damned ship. Mark didn't raise his voice, didn't even look directly at her when they finally sat down, the luxurious living room now a stifling prison. His words were measured, precise, each one a surgical strike against the pathetic remnants of her defenses. There it all was, not just proof of the affair that she'd almost expected, but a tapestry of lies so intricate it was horrifying in its scope. Manipulations so subtle she hadn't even recognized them at the time, a long, sickening trail of deceit that made her core betrayal seem almost incidental. The consequences were laid out with chilling clarity. He wasn't merely divorcing her, his goal was complete annihilation. Legal action, orchestrated leaks to those still clinging to a shred of sympathy, even threats against her parents as leverage to ensure his demands were met. It was monstrous, almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. Yet his tone remained dispassionate, even as he shattered what remained of her world. It took days, perhaps weeks, for the enormity of it all to truly sink in. She was adrift in a wreckage of her own making. Her family was a curt letter from a lawyer. The lover vanished the second his own liability became obvious, and even those who pitted her now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. The isolation was the worst punishment of all. Her tormentor didn't need to appear physically. The phone calls began, always from untraceable numbers, the taunting voice distorted, reveling in her destruction and promising new, unspecified tortures to come. She stopped sleeping, the boundary between nightmares and reality so blurred she screamed herself hoarse to a backdrop of empty silence. It started with subtle doubts. Was that car parked across the street truly a threat or just a neighbor? The whispered behind her in the grocery aisle, a figment of her tortured mind or something far more sinister. Each potential threat was a fresh blow, shattering her sanity piece by agonizing piece. Then came the article, not a local rag, but a national outlet hungry for a juicy scandal. The photo, a damning embrace with her lover, was grainy, but it was enough. Her name wasn't mentioned, yet anyone remotely familiar would recognize her. The mocking commentary, insinuations of criminality and twisted perversions brought a raw, animalistic scream to her lips. They'd finally done it. She was no longer just ruined, she was a spectacle. Her face, her story became meme fodder, photoshopped into grotesque parodies that were shared relentlessly. The faceless masses who'd never known her, who didn't even care about the truth, tore her apart for their amusement. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Strangers peered at her with a mix of recognition and avid curiosity, waiting for her to break down for their amusement. She had become their grotesque entertainment, a real-life soap opera where the villain's ending could never be tragic enough. The retreat was inevitable, not a strategic hiding, rather a collapsing inward. Her once immaculate home became a garbage-strewn bunker, the curtains drawn against the accusing light. Sanity, tenuous as it was, finally slipped its bonds. She talked to the shadows, to the flickering TV screen, to imagined versions of those she'd lost. Perhaps this was hospitalization, maybe a self-made exile to some remote cabin. The details no longer mattered. Penn's Park. Her ending wasn't a single dramatic act, but the slow erosion of her very self. There was no redemption to be found, no sliver of her old life worth salvaging. Her name, her face, her story, nothing was truly hers anymore. She was simply a cautionary tale, whispered in judgmental tones, and that broken echo was, okay, you know you're in for a wild ride when a story starts with tequila and smash lipstick, right? So, it was one of those girls' night out deals. Me, Sarah, my partner in crime since middle school, a whole lot of margaritas, and a club packed so tight you could barely breathe. Typical Thursday, am I right? Meanwhile, Mike, Mr. Perfect Husband, was supposedly meeting up with his buddy Rick. Honestly, when he said, boys' night, I rolled my eyes but didn't think much of it. Guys need to blow off steam too, whatever. I stumbled home way past midnight, a buzz still humming through my brain. The house was pitch black, and for a second, I felt a twinge of guilt. Mike's always the responsible one, tucked into bed by 10. I probably sounded like a herd of elephants. Shrugging it off, I crashed into bed, images of the dance floor swirling in my head. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a weird sense of unease. Mike was in the kitchen, making coffee like nothing was out of the ordinary. The sight of him, all calm and normal, should have been comforting, but that unease lingered. You okay? He asked, giving me one of his half smiles. I nodded. Then something flickered in my memory. Had there been a smudge of red on his collar last night? A lipstick stain? I tried to play it cool, but the image was stuck in my head. He wouldn't, would he? Work was a blur. I kept replaying that image, trying to convince myself it was tequila-fueled paranoia. Still, at lunch, I hit up Sarah. You know how best friends have that weird mind-link thing? Turns out, she'd been at the same crappy bar we were at, and yeah, she saw Rick. With some blonde bombshell hanging all over him. My stomach flipped. That's when it hit me, a bolt of pure rage shooting through me. I don't know how I stayed calm enough to say, family emergency, to my boss, but next thing I knew, I was barreling home. I stormed right into Mike's home office, his supposed sanctuary, where I was never allowed to disturb his genius. He wasn't there, but something else was. A pile of clothes on the floor, and beside it, my favorite red lipstick, crushed into a million pieces. It was like a scene in a bad movie. Suddenly, every stupid little thing, every late night he spent working, every time he'd brushed off my questions, clicked into place. I wasn't just imagining things. This whole time, the bastard. My scream echoed through the suddenly too quiet house. Mike. I shrieked again, fury boiling over. No answer. Of course not, the coward. I was shaking, equal parts rage, and a fear I couldn't name. My hands found my phone before I even consciously thought about it. First, Mike's mom, then his dad. They were surprised to hear from me, their voices a weird mix of clueless and concerned. Did something happen? Is Mike okay? I wanted to scream. Ask your precious son, but held back, barely. Next, I dialed Rick's wife. Now, that woman and I have never been what you'd call friendly. Even so, hearing her panicked voice made me realize we were in the same sinking boat. She sounded just as lost as I was, maybe even more terrified. Rick hadn't come home either. Okay, so the cheaters were missing. But where the hell were they? And was that blonde bombshell with them? My mind spun out of control, conjuring up images of them laughing at us, clinking champagne glasses on some tropical beach. No way was I letting them get away with this. Suddenly, it hit me, Dan, Mike's younger brother. We weren't exactly besties, Dan and I, more like polite strangers at family gatherings. But desperate times call for desperate measures. When he answered, he sounded groggy and confused. Hey, is Mike there? I tried to sound casual, but my voice was shaking. No, why? He left early this morning. With Rick, said something about a fishing trip, Dan mumbled. Fishing trip? My ass. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. That lying piece of, okay, I won't repeat what I thought, but you get the picture. Those two weren't catching salmon. They were running from the mess they made. I hung up on Dan without another word. I was already halfway to my car, keys jangling in my hand. Red lights, more like suggestions as I floored the gas pedal. Every mile I drove towards Dan's shabby little house, the fury inside me grew. How dare they do this to me, to us? Pulling up in a cloud of dust, I saw Dan on his porch, pacing back and forth. He looked almost as freaked out as I felt. The moment I got out of my car, the words came tumbling out. Where is he, Dan? Don't play dumb. Where did they go? My voice was a low growl now, the rage vibrating in every word. Wait, what? I felt like someone had slapped me. Fishing trip, my ass. Dan's words hung in the air, cash, duffel bags. My mind scrambled to make sense of them. What do you mean, more than fishing? Dan shifted uncomfortably. Listen, I don't know the whole story, but the past few weeks, Mike's been over here a lot. Late nights, talking low, always on edge. And this morning, when he showed up, there was this. He trailed off, seeming to search for the right word, intensity about him. Intensity. I was about to blow my top. Tell me what you saw, Dan. Everything. He hesitated, then spilled it. There was a pile of cash on the kitchen table. Thousands. Way more than you'd take fishing. And those duffel bags, they weren't packed with rods and bait. It felt wrong. Wrong was an understatement. A sickening realization started to dawn. This wasn't about some affair. This was something way bigger, way scarier. Images of those movies where someone gets mixed up with the wrong people flashed through my head. Mike, my sweet, nerdy Mike? How is this even possible? Then, a wave of pure panic washed over me. Whatever Mike was tangled up in, it sounded dangerous. My fingers fumbled with my phone, desperately dialing Sarah. I needed her, the only person right now who might be able to get my head on straight. She answered on the first ring, the background noise of traffic telling me she was probably still out and about. I poured out what Dan had just told me, my voice shaking. She didn't interrupt, just let me spew out the crazy story in a jumbled mess. After a minute of stunned silence, Sarah's voice came through, sharp and focused. Hold on, let me think. I swear, I could hear the clicking of her keyboard from miles away. That girl loves her online detective work a little too much. Okay, got something, she said after what felt like forever. Mike's online activity, it's weird. Late night sessions, random gambling sites, stuff that doesn't fit his profile at all. Looks like he's been racking up serious losses. Losses. Cash. Everything was starting to click into a terrifying picture. Suddenly, the late nights and the weird tension made horrifying sense. Mike wasn't working overtime. He was desperately trying to dig himself out of a financial hole. Had it gotten so deep he was about to do something drastic? Then, Sarah dropped another bombshell. Rick's in the same boat. Got fired a few weeks ago. Turns out he was blowing company money on even worse gambling sites than Mike. His wife was about to walk out. Two losers, both on the brink, disappearing together. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Just then, Dan, who'd been mostly silent, chimed in with a voice barely above a whisper. Mike, he's been talking crazy. Saying stuff like, one big score and all his problems would be gone. Saying they'd never have to worry about money again. The three of us were huddled on Dan's porch, the whole thing feeling completely surreal. A family crisis meeting triggered by broken hearts, bad bets, and a whole lot of bad decisions. We pieced together the fragments, each memory slotting into a disturbingly clear picture. Mike's hushed conversations with Dan, the desperation in his eyes that I'd mistaken for exhaustion, it all seemed so obvious now. You didn't think this was suspicious at the time? I snapped at Dan, a surge of anger momentarily masking my fear. He looked sheepish, mumbling something about not wanting to pry. Listen, hindsight's a wonderful thing. Sarah chimed in over the speakerphone, ever the voice of reason. We need to focus on what we know right now. Mike and Rick are in trouble, big trouble. The words hung heavy in the air. Panic and a cold fury warred within me. The cops. Was that the right move? What if this really was some stupid scheme gone wrong, and I just dragged the authorities into our personal mess? But then, the image of that smashed lipstick flashed, a reminder of the betrayal, the lies that started this whole avalanche. My gut twisted, call it intuition, call it desperation, but something deep down told me Mike had crossed a line, way past cheating. There was no more innocent until proven guilty, for him. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. Explaining it all was a nightmare. I stumbled over the words, gambling debts, strange cash, disappearing husbands. The dispatcher sounded doubtful, like I was describing a plot from a bad soap opera, not my reality. But the cops showed up surprisingly fast, blue lights flashing in the fading daylight. Two officers, a man with a skeptical frown and a younger woman with a no-nonsense air about her. They listened, took notes, asked probing questions. Dan chimed in, awkward and hesitant. Sarah even did a long-distance statement over my crackly phone, her voice sharp with urgency. The more we talked, the more serious the officers seemed to get. The initial doubt faded, replaced by a cautious concern. The woman officer, Officer Ramirez, her badge said, "Look me straight in the eye. We'll get into this," she said firmly. "Missing persons, suspicious activity, it warrants an investigation. Might be longer than you expect, but we take stuff like this seriously." Seriously was the key word. Somehow, it wasn't just about cheating anymore. The police were sniffing out something bigger, something potentially criminal. A small part of me hoped they were wrong, that Mike would get fished out of some lake, sheepish and hungover from a dumb boys' trip. But the realist in me, the part fueled by rage and fear, knew that hope was a dangerous gamble right now. After the cops left, an unsettling silence fell over the porch. Dan hovered awkwardly, looking like he wanted to disappear into thin air. Sarah's voice crackled through my phone's speaker, a lifeline in this suddenly bleak reality. But even her usual pep talk sounded hollow. We were stranded, a band of misfits thrown together by the whirlwind of Mike and Rick's idiotic decisions. The following days morphed into a waking nightmare. Each ring of my phone was like an electric shock, but never the one I prayed for. Instead, there were tense updates from Officer Ramirez filled with more questions than answers, bill collectors demanding payments I couldn't make, and pitiful calls from Mike's mom with her trembling voice, a voice that made me want to both hug her and scream at her for raising such a fool. My life imploded. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, replaced by endless nights staring at the ceiling. Even during the day, I couldn't seem to eat solid food, my stomach twisting with a mix of dread and nausea. I tried working, seeking the familiar comfort of numbers, but every spreadsheet started to look like a tally of Mike's debts, a constant reminder of how badly he messed up. One night, fueled by insomnia and a sick need for answers, I scrolled through old photos. We looked so happy then, Mike and me, grinning back at the camera during our honeymoon in the Bahamas. I zoomed in on one picture, studying it with a strange intensity. Something was off, a nagging detail at the edge of my vision. Wait, wasn't that Rick? Half hidden in the background, chatting with some random guy on the beach. A cold nod formed in my stomach. How long had this been going on? This wasn't just a recent lapse in judgment. This was something deeper. Had Mike and Rick been scheming even back then? Sarah, I fumbled for my phone, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Sarah, wake up, I need you. She grumbled something about crazy conspiracies, but I ignored her. Her blurry-eyed image appeared on the screen after a few agonizing seconds. I shoved the honeymoon photo at the camera, practically shouting, "Look, is that Rick? Do you remember seeing him there?" Sarah, bless her, snapped into focus. Her eyes scanned the photo, then widened. "Oh crap," she whispered. "Now that you mention it." Fueled by a volatile mix of caffeine and fury, Sarah and I became internet bloodhounds. We scrolled through years of photos, cross-referencing them with social media posts. The truth was undeniable. Mike and Rick had been lurking in the background of each other's lives way longer than I'd realized. There they were, grinning awkwardly at a college party, caught in the corner of a blurry selfie at some beach bar. Had this been their master plan all along? The doorbell jolted me out of my frenzy. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of hope and dread gnawing my stomach. It wasn't the cops. It was someone I'd never expected to see on my doorstep. "Hi," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm Lisa, Rick's wife." It was the most surreal moment of my life. There we stood, two women devastated by the same two idiots, forced to play this twisted game of connect the dots. I think I offered tea or something equally useless, and we sat down on the couch, facing each other like awkward strangers. It turned into a support group meeting we never asked for. I poured out my story, the lipstick, the lies, everything. Lisa, her features tight with a barely concealed rage, mirrored my tale. Rick had been sinking their finances into the same black hole of online gambling. Apparently, her threat to leave wasn't an empty one. She'd packed her bags that very same morning the guys disappeared. And that's when the picture became horribly clear. Two desperate men, drowning in debt, vanishing with a suspicious amount of cash. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. This wasn't about running off with blondes. This was something far more dangerous. Had they cooked up some idiotic scheme for a quick buck and gotten themselves in way over their heads? Lisa stood up abruptly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. "I'm staying with my sister," she said, voice trembling slightly. "It's safer this way." Just as she was about to walk out, she turned and her words chilled me to bone. "Honestly, it's probably better they disappeared together. After what he's done, I don't know what I'd do if I found Rick." The look in her eyes, a mix of fear and fury, mirrored my own. That night, my dreams were a dark twist on reality. I saw Mike and Rick, not on some tropical beach, but bound and gagged in a dank basement, or worse, at the bottom of the river. Suddenly, Mike wasn't a villain anymore. He was the victim too. The next morning, renewed terror propelled me to action. I dialed Officer Ramirez again, a desperate pleading edge to my voice. The usual, "we're working on it," didn't cut it anymore. I needed results, needed them to find Mike before whoever he was mixed up with did. "Sarah," her voice crisp over the phone, snapped me back into focus. "Okay, we need a plan. Those cops aren't moving fast enough, so it's up to us." Suddenly, the fear and helplessness morphed into a kind of twisted determination. We were an unlikely detective duo, but right now, Mike's safety and bringing him to justice rested on our shoulders. Driving to that seedy-looking bar, my heart thudded against my ribs. With Sarah hunched over her laptop in the passenger seat, navigating a world of shady forums and back-alley gambling sites, it felt like a scene out of a bad crime thriller. Except, this was my life now. A world of dive bars, desperation, and a relentless search for answers. The bar itself was all neon signs and despair. Inside, stale beer and cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air. A soundtrack of clanging slot machines and weary laughter formed the background score to this tragedy. We scanned the room, searching for any sign of Mike or Rick. Then, something made my stomach drop. There, tucked away in a dimly lit corner, sat a figure hunched over a poker table. It couldn't be, but it was. Dan, Mike's brother, the quiet one I never really knew. Seeing him here hit me harder than any revelation about Mike. A flurry of conflicting emotions swirled within me. Fury at the possibility of his involvement, confusion about how he fit into this mess, and a strange, stinging sense of betrayal. "Wait," Sarah whispered, grabbing my arm. "Don't assume the worst. Maybe he's in the same boat as us, looking for Mike too." And suddenly, just like that, he spotted us. The color drained from his face, and he fumbled towards us, knocking over his beer in his haste. His story spilled out in panicked bursts. Dan wasn't a crook, he was another victim. Mike had played him, sweet-talking him into investing in some sure thing a few weeks back. Dan, trusting his brother implicitly, had sunk his entire life savings into it, money meant for the down payment on his dream house. The revelation landed like a physical blow. It wasn't just gambling addiction, it was deliberate manipulation. Mike had used his own brother, exploiting his trust to fuel this insane scheme. A sickening feeling washed over me. This tangled web of deceit went deeper than cheating or even criminal activity. It was a betrayal of family, of trust, of something fundamentally decent. Leaving the bar, the three of us stood under the flickering streetlight, a pathetic image of those screwed over by the same person. Dan sobbed, shoulders hunched in defeat. He was broken, financially destroyed and crushed under the weight of his brother's actions. An odd wave of pity washed over me. As angry as I was at Mike, seeing Dan like this twisted something in my gut. Standing there with Dan, watching his shoulders shake with sobs, something inside me shifted. It wasn't forgiveness for Mike, far from it, but maybe a warped sense of responsibility. Here we were, two people utterly screwed over by the same man, both caught in the destructive wake of his lies and schemes. "We'll get through this," I heard myself saying, the words sounding strange even to my own ears. Dan stared at me like I might have lost my mind, a flicker of something. Was it hope? In his tired eyes, "We'll work it out, figure out a way to fix this mess." The next few days were a blur of relentless investigation. Sarah, with newfound determination, dove deep into the murky world of cryptocurrency and suspicious online transactions. I learned more about the dark side of the internet than I ever cared to. Mike and Rick, it turned out, weren't just dabbling in some small-town gambling den. They had somehow gotten themselves mixed up with high-stakes poker rings, where the amounts being wagered made my head spin. This wasn't about some desperate attempt to win back a few thousand. It felt bigger, scarier, a whole different level of dangerous. Suddenly, we weren't chasing cheating husbands. We were potentially tangling with people I didn't even want to imagine. Driven by a desperate need for action, I did something I swore I wouldn't. I called the cops again. This time, instead of platitudes, I hammered them with every bit of information we'd dug up. The cryptocurrency trail, the shady poker forums, everything. Officer Ramirez, usually cool and reserved, sounded different this time. There was a sharpness in her voice, a sense of urgency that mirrored my own. Then, a glimmer of hope. A potential sighting, a guy matching Mike's description at a gas station a few hours north. It was flimsy, the cops warned, but they were mobilizing. For the first time in days, the knot in my stomach loosened, just a fraction. The three of us, me, Sarah, and Dan, the world's most mismatched team of detectives, piled into my car. It was a road trip born of desperation, a mix of terror and the tiniest flicker of ridiculous hope. Had Mike snapped, trying to just run from the consequences? Was Rick with him? And, even more importantly, was there a stash of cash? As we drove, my mind raced, churning up every possible scenario. I saw Mike in handcuffs, in a shootout, in a broken heap on the side of the road. All of it seemed more likely than him sipping cocktails with some blonde on a tropical island. The cheating, the lipstick. That felt like a million years ago. We were in uncharted territory now, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to know what lay at the end of